Darlings, I thought tonight, as there is a raging storm outside the house and the weather is diabolical, to be honest, we're being threatened with a snow bomb on the happy hills over the moors. So that made me think of The Sixth Winter by Douglas Orgill and John Gribbin. Yeah, there we go. The first published in January the 1st, 1979, and that is this edition here in my hand. Yeah, and it was a Christmas present a couple of years ago from my husband, and I felt that tonight was the night that we're going to do the Ice Age. So let's begin. This novel was written by a gentleman called John R. Gribbin, and he's a British science writer and an astrophysicist and a visiting fellow in astronomy at the University of Sussex. Topical range of his works includes quantum physics, biographies of famous scientists, human evolution, the origins of the universe, climate change and global warming, and he also writes science fiction. John graduated with a bachelor's degree in physics from the University of Sussex in 1966. He then earned his Master of Science in Astronomy in 1967. Also from the University of Sussex. He then went on to do a PhD in astrophysics from the University of Cambridge in 1971. In 1968, John worked as one of Fred Hoyle's research students at the Institute of Theoretical Astronomy and wrote numerous stories for the New Scientist about the Institute's research and what were eventually discovered to be pulsars. So he's definitely of a scientific mind, which helps because this is a very fantastic novel, but it's also very scientific. I'll tell you now about Douglas Orgill. Born in Walsall, Staffordshire, on August the 10th, 1922, and died February the 1st, 1984. He's a UK author, mostly thrillers from the early 1960s, of science fiction, and he has two novels with John Gribbin. Douglas obtained his degree in history at Oxford, and he fought in the Second World War in the Tank Division. I'm afraid there's not very much information regarding Douglas Orgill, although I wish there was, because between the two of them they have written the definitive guide of what to do if you're ever hit with an ice age. We shall continue. I wrote a lengthy little appraisal for you, so I'm going to read that out to you now. You have to remember that this novel was written in the 1970s, when the Milankovitch cycle was actually understood. Our writers postulate about the upcoming Ice Age. Of course, scientists of the time said that according to the cycles, we should be beginning a new Ice Age shortly. The shortly could mean in 1,000 years because of the length of geological time. Due to a media frenzy in the 70s, around the time this book was written, sensationalizing the findings into a mini frenzy that an actual ice age was imminent, pardon the pun here, cooler heads eventually prevailed and the frenzy died down. The key wording here is scientists weren't saying anything was imminent in the human timescale of hundreds of years. I would say this novel is a what if the Ice Age was starting. It's well written, covers various groups of people and cultures from around the world as they suffer through and try to figure out how to survive what is happening to their world. This novel represents a time in our history when we simply didn't understand as much as we do now. When we actually know what global warming will cause massive problems and environmental and social upheaval. The way the novel describes the suffering and the brutality of the situation that the world finds itself in is very unsettling. We then, as now, are refusing to believe that it is even possible it can happen, never mind how we are going to prepare for it. So, with that in mind as my front runner, here we are with the plot. If you were ever wondering where the idea for The Day After Tomorrow came from, this is it. It's a climatic tour de force full of lots of great characters and drama. We start with our main character, Dr. William Stovin, a climatologist. He is convinced that his belief in the Ice Age of antiquity was not a slow phenomenon, but one brought on by extreme and devastating rapidity brought about by climatic changes. The pattern of winters today is producing the same effect, increasingly cold winters, which will take the world to the point of no return if repeated 5 times in a row. As Stovin's predictions come true, our world suddenly changes, plunging the USA, Soviet Union and all of Europe into panic and chaos. Vast, immeasurable storms of unprecedented savagery. We have a catastrophic snowstorm that sweeps over the northern hemisphere. It's at this point that Stovin assembles a climate team, and with the support of the President of the United States, he sets off to explore the tragic conditions we find ourselves in. Stovin and his team are soon caught up in a fight for survival. Trapped in the Siberian wastelands, his crew is forced to make its way across the Bering Strait. They have to learn the way of the Eskimo before it's too late. Accompanying Dr. Stovin is Diane Hilda, a beautiful young expert on wolf behaviour, who is observed in the changing patterns of the wolf packs, a warning of the return of the Ice Age perhaps. We have Bisbee, the half Eskimo bush pilot, who is accepted by neither the white nor the Eskimo world. He's a half-breed. Oh, that's how he's described in the novel. And yet, Bisbee possesses the ultimate skill set to save his companions. Yeah, if I was on this expedition, I'd certainly want somebody like Bisbee, who knows his onions. Except they didn't have any onions on this trip, but he does know about them. Volkov, a Soviet bureaucrat, well, aren't they all, comrades, charged with showing the American visitors. Oh, I bet he's loving that. Oh, yeah. Anyway, he's in charge of taking care of the entire team whilst they're in Russia, or as it's referred to so lovingly in this book, the Soviet Union. Now you can see how old the terminologies are within this novel. Anyway, Volkov, the Soviet bureaucrat charged with showing the American visitors the disaster that has struck a major Siberian city. He is unwilling to abandon his belief in the Soviet system, even though it is crumbling before his very eyes, under the onslaught of the new Ice Age. We have a young scientist called Soldatov, who, with his young wife Valentina, they join the party of the fellow scientists, and they are also forced to flee with them across the barren Arctic wastes. God, I can read my own writing. Anyway, I'm going to read you now the prologue because it really sets the novel up. Right, and here we are. The Watcher crouched in the stony outcrop above the lake. He shifted his 120 pounds of weight and braced his clawed feet against the rocks, staring intently before him. Half a mile away, alternately swelling and receding against the sparse yellow scrub of the tundra, a brown cloud of animals drifted slowly nearer. From over to the east, where a glittering blue tongue of water ended in a wilderness of stunted alder and ash, the Watcher on the rocks could hear the bellowing of the beasts and the steady thumping and splashing as the first caribou plunged into the shallow water, half walking, half wading, and made for the southern bank. The caribou were much nearer now, and the Watcher flicked his long tongue over his black lips as the leader of the herd struggled out of the mud. The wolf was at the very edge of his territory. He had marked it with his strong yellow urine 10 weeks before, and no other had yet presumed to cross it. But what was happening in front of him was something completely new in his experience, and he sought to take advantage of it. Turning abruptly, he moved off at an easy lope, 5 or 6 miles an hour, keeping parallel with the herd, making no attempt at concealment. Ahead was a long, shallow defile, cut deep into the permafrost of the tundra of the Canadian Northwest Territories by the grinding of a glacier long ago. The leaders of the caribou were already pouring into it in a heaving forest of antlers, followed by the hinds and the stumbling fawns. When the wolf stopped in a patch of high scree, he threw back his head and howled. Almost 2 miles away, the wolf howl came as a whisper, the merest thread of a sound. To the man who was carefully dismantling and cleaning his binoculars on the table in a little hut set in the meandering belt of green spruce beside one of the small streams that fed Lake Enadi, he crossed to the dusty window and looked up the long bare hill, whistling in surprise. A man was slithering down the muddy slope in front of him. He wore a faded tartan lumber jacket over a red shirt and thick tweed trousers. His face was broad and flat, his hair lank, black. He carried a hunting rifle, and the pack of a radio transmitter was humped on his back. The white man in the hut went to the doorway as he approached. "What the hell?" he said. "You're back early, Attu. I didn't expect." "A radio no good," said the Eskimo briefly. "I came to tell." "Tell what?" "Tuk-tu," said Attu, pointing beyond the swell of the far ridge. "Tuk-tu me, the Haribo host." "What, the host?" said the white man incredulously. He jerked his thumb at the cloudless blue of the sky. "Migrating now? Never." "Tuk-tu me, soon you will see." "How many?" "Here, 20 score, perhaps 30 score. Beyond them, I think many." "Only 500? Well, that's not the host, is it? Just a bit of it. That's gone crazy, I guess." "It is the beginning," said Attu. He crossed to the cupboard at the end of the little living room and took out a belt of cartridges. "There was a wolf." "I heard him," said the other thoughtfully. "But—" "And you have heard that before?" asked Attu, his voice heavy with irony. "You have heard a wolf give the caribou call when the host is not moving?" "But damn it, it's so early," said the white man. "You must be wrong." From beyond the ridge came once more that long, stretched thread of sound. "The wolf is not wrong," said Attu. Now, doesn't that just set you up for the entire novel? I mean, herds running out of season, the wolf call when it shouldn't be doing the wolf call, months in advance. That tells you something has gone wrong. Something is incredibly wrong and off kilter with the climate. And that's why I love this book so much. I have, over the years, worked for quite a few scientists, and they've all had the same thing to say. The climate has changed and is changing dramatically. Although some of these events are cyclical, there are other events that are happening that are not supposed to be happening, and thus that puts us in a situation where climate change is running away from us faster than we can slow it down or change our habits in order to prevent what's coming. Although it was written in the 70s, it's very much a book of our time. Some of the science in here is flawed, some of it isn't. And even though it's told in a story format, some of the science that has been used, that is correct, can be seen as a little alarmist. And to say it's nearly, well, it's over 50 years ago now, isn't it? Because obviously with this being in it's 1979, not 1971, sorry. So in when it gets to 2029, yeah, then it'll be 50 years. But can you imagine how much things have changed in that time? It's amazing. And There is a little bit in here for a friend of mine from Canada. Now I'm just going to read that bit to you, because he's always said to me that I read a lot of kind of books that seem to ignore Canada. So I'll read you this little bit. "We are having the same problem," said the secretary, so quietly that the Canadian did not hear him. "The Chinook," said the Canadian minister, "is a winter-spring wind. It normally blows down the side of any east-moving depression, like we're getting a series of right now. It's a very useful wind, relatively warm and dry, and it can raise atmospheric temperatures by as much as 30 degrees in a quarter of an hour. It makes pasture and grain growing possible right down to the spine of this continent, down from our Mackenzie River into your Colorado." "And," said the president. "It does not blow any more," said the Canadian. "Some of the temperatures we are getting in Saskatchewan are unbelievably low, and there's nothing to alleviate them. We came to a decision in Ottawa yesterday that we will be announcing tomorrow we are going to have to evacuate Winnipeg. Mr. President, 750,000 people. We have had nearly 600 deaths in the city in the last week. Mostly folk whose heating has failed, or who are old and ill. But the Prime Minister has been told the situation will get steadily worse, so we're moving out of Winnipeg. God help us, and God help them." "I've got news for you, Minister," said the Secretary of Defence briskly. "You talk about Winnipeg, I'm talking about Chicago. We're going to—" The President held up his hand, and the Secretary of Defence subsided. How are you doing along that stretch of the Canadian United States frontier south of Winnipeg?" The Canadian pursed his lips. "I'm afraid a lot of people are coming across, Mr. President. It's human instinct, I guess, to head south, even though they are heading into what are probably much the same conditions. People are seeing their homes, their towns steadily overwhelmed. They won't worry about any frontier. Nevertheless, we can't cope with tens of thousands of Canadian refugees," said the Secretary of Defence. "We have very much the same problem ourselves in the north. We're pulling virtually every old person, woman and child, out of Fargo, in North Dakota, for instance, and now there's Chicago." "Yes," said the Canadian suddenly. He sounded tired and defeated. "We're going to evacuate Chicago suburb by suburb. That's around 3 million people, Minister. Our second biggest city is going to need a lot of discipline, and it's going to need every available kind of transport, from helicopters to farm carts. Above all, it's going to need clear roads. There's only a limited number of roads, even now, that we can keep clear. We can't take in Canadians on that scale." He turned to the President. "I've moved additional National Guard units up around that section of the border, Mr. President. As of this morning, they have orders to turn back those who are not United States nationals." "But what if," said the Canadian. He saw the President's face and stopped in time. The President's voice was so mild that Bruckman, who now knew him better than any of the others, looked up sharply and felt a prickle of fear down his spine. What did you say you had done, Henry? Given orders to turn them back, said the secretary. That frontier hasn't needed soldiers for a very long time, said the president. It doesn't need them now. Get them out of there, Henry. At least keep them there, but to help, not to hinder. You do that. But surely, said the secretary desperately, we can't be sentimental. These are our own people who are being put at risk if the roads get any more jammed than they are. We can be sentimental, said the president, because if we aren't, by golly, we may as well be ants or wolves or rats. So you change those orders, Henry. I'll do it as soon as the meeting's over, said the secretary. Do it now, Henry, said the president gently. The secretary looked at him for 2 long seconds and then rose to his feet and left the room. Thank you, Mr. President, said the Canadian. The president laughed shortly. Don't thank me, Jean-Pierre. I may call you Jean-Pierre. Please, of course. You may be able to help us as well as we can help you. We're in all sorts of trouble in Washington State and Northern Oregon. Could be we'll ask you to let some people move into British Columbia. You say that area's clear? It's much better than the areas to the east, said the Canadian. There are parts that have even had heavy rain, but no snow. As to what you suggest, I shall, of course, inform the Prime Minister immediately. I feel sure, however, well, we are one continent, are we not? That's how I see it, said the President. We too have snow-free areas, even in parts where you wouldn't imagine that could be so. There's a big stretch of South Dakota, isn't there, Mel? So, at least the Canadians weren't forgotten this time. As for the United Kingdom, we don't fare very well in this book at all. Our entire island will be eventually buried. We'll all be buried alive or frozen to death. We will definitely freeze to death before we starve to death, that's for sure. What a happy thought. Sorry about this. I keep getting these silly little flash-ups on my computer. I do apologise. Anyway, you're left with a very, very bleak ending. Can they get back to America via the old Eskimo ways of the reindeer and sled? Will the American Air Force find them? What will become of the remaining survivors? Who knows? I honestly absolutely love this book. Although it's dated in terms of technology and its attitudes towards women and people of ethnic minorities, it's still a fantastic read. Considering today's coming global warming catastrophe, let's hope we manage to slow down our impending doom, or, better still, live in hope we can reverse the damage we have inflicted on Mother Earth. I highly recommend this novel, so I will give it a solid 10 out of 10. Can you imagine if the director, the master of disaster, Irwin Allen, had made this into a movie? Of course it would have been fantastic. An absolute salute to the 1970s disaster movie genre. Oops, there we go. Chair's gone. That's an old, I'm sitting in a very old chair. Let's hope we never have to find out. But honestly, speaking of climatology and scientists, having spent the length of time that I have with scientists over the years, I do hope we haven't set the course of planet Earth on a irreversible pathway, and I do hope that our governments that lead us can eventually sit round a table and realise that the way we are living cannot continue. It just can't. We're going to go to hell in a handcart if we don't do something. And I will say what I have seen with the people I've worked with. Every nation on this earth is preparing. Now, some would say we're preparing for a war. Well, in certain respects, it is almost a war, but it's not a war of conventional means of bullets. It's a war on the climate, and the climate is waging war on us, and we're not helping ourselves. We really aren't. So let this be a cautionary tale that we should slow down. You know the saying, less is more? Well, in this case, yes. If we can slow down, if we can find a more sustainable way of existing, then we may have half a chance. Sorry to leave it on such a sad note, but I do think it's a subject that needs to be discussed. And I'll say what I always say, my darlings. Happy readings and enjoy. If you have enjoyed this, give me a thumbs up. If you like what I do, you could always try subscribing. And I thank you very much for tuning in on a very wintry Thursday evening. And thank you very much, my darlings, and take care of yourselves.